Imagine a stadium, not filled with the roar of a crowd for a game, but with a vast, silent sea of uniformity. The air is thick, not with electric anticipation, but with a heavy, almost sacred stillness. Thousands upon thousands of couples, a human mosaic of identical white gowns and dark suits, stand in perfect, unnerving rows under an indifferent sky. They stretch from one end of the field to the other, a living testament to a singular will. Zoom in on a single pair. A young woman from Germany, her face a mask of serene obedience. Her hand held by a man from Japan she met only hours before. They do not share a language, a culture, or a past. Their only common ground is the man standing on the distant stage, the architect of their union. They are strangers, their futures decided not by love, courtship, or choice, but by a single photograph and the absolute decree of that one man. At the center of this immense, surreal ceremony stands that man, Sun Myung Moon. To his followers, he is not just a leader. He is the Messiah, the true Father, the physical embodiment of God's will on earth, come to complete the unfinished work of Christ. His posture is rigid. His gaze sweeps across the multitude as if counting souls. When his voice booms through the loudspeakers, it is not just a voice. It is a divine instrument recalibrating the destinies of everyone present. With a sprinkle of what they are told is holy water, he binds these thousands of souls together in a sacred, unbreakable union. It is a factory of families, an assembly line of devotion, creating a single global family under his absolute authority. But this breathtaking spectacle, this grand theater of faith, broadcast to the world as a symbol of divine harmony, was only the visible face of a much larger, more complex machine. It was the exhaust plume of a colossal, unseen engine. An engine fueled by the tireless, round-the-clock labor of its followers, selling flowers on cold street corners, by multi-million-dollar business ventures spanning continents, from fishing fleets in Alaska to influential newspapers in Washington, D.C. An engine whose gears turned in the quiet, carpeted offices of political power, greased by strategic alliances and immense financial contributions. Behind the serene smiles and vows of eternal loyalty lay a hidden architecture of power, a meticulously designed system that stretched from the war-torn hills of Korea to the very heart of Western democracy. How did one man convince so many to surrender everything, their lives, their fortunes, their families, and their very identities? This question cuts to the core of the human experience. It forces us to confront our deepest needs for purpose, for belonging, for a truth that can silence the chaos of the world. This is not simply the story of a new religion or a controversial cult. It is the story of how belief can be weaponized, how devotion can be systematically engineered, and how a spiritual movement became a global empire built on a terrifyingly effective vision of control. It is a chilling exploration of the mechanics of the human mind, the architecture of manipulation, and the shadowy space where faith ends and a global machine begins. To understand the machine, we must first understand the world that built it. Our story begins not in a boardroom or a modern auditorium, but in the ashes of a nation torn apart. The Korea of the mid-1950s was a landscape of ghosts, a peninsula carved in two by ideology and scorched by a war that had left cities as skeletal remains and an entire generation adrift. The air itself seemed heavy with the dust of collapsed buildings and the silence of extinguished lives. The Japanese occupation was a recent, painful memory, a deep scar of humiliation on the national psyche. The Korean War had ripped that scar wide open, replacing it with a fresh, gaping trauma, a wound that cut through families, villages, and the very soul of the country, pitting brother against brother in a conflict orchestrated by distant global powers. In this shattered land, survival was a daily, visceral battle, but a deeper hunger gnawed at the people, a hunger for meaning. The old structures, the rigid hierarchies of Confucianism, the quiet contemplation of Buddhism, the ancient rituals of shamanism had failed to provide a shield against tanks and napalm. They offered no explanation for the sheer scale of the suffering, no comfort for a loss so absolute. The world had proven to be a place of profound, incomprehensible chaos. This created a spiritual vacuum, a vast, empty space where desperation and hope grew intertwined like weeds. People were searching for an anchor, a powerful, all-encompassing explanation for their pain, and a promise of a future that was not drenched in blood and sorrow. It was a fertile ground for new prophets, their voices rising from the rubble, each offering a unique and urgent path to salvation, a new map for a world that had lost its way. This spiritual yearning was fused with a powerful political terror, the fear of communism. The 38th parallel was not just a line on a map, it was a metaphysical boundary, the smoldering frontier in a holy war against a godless enemy to the north. Anti-communism in South Korea was more than a policy. It was a state religion, a righteous crusade that defined good and evil in absolute, unyielding terms. It was taught in schools, preached from pulpits, and reinforced by a government fighting for its very existence. Communism was portrayed as an existential threat, a demonic force that sought to extinguish not just freedom, but Korean identity, family, and God himself. Any ideology that could merge divine purpose with this fierce political mission, that could frame the fight against the North as a sacred cosmic battle, was destined to find a powerful foothold. It offered a way to sanctify the hatred and fear, to turn political allegiance into a form of spiritual devotion. It was a perfect storm of spiritual need, national trauma, and ideological fervor. A generation had been orphaned, not just from their parents, but from their history and their faith. They were adrift in a sea of uncertainty, desperate for a charismatic leader who could speak with absolute certainty, who could offer a narrative powerful enough to make sense of the senseless. They needed a father figure for a nation of orphans. And into this crucible, a man would step forward, a man with eyes that seemed to hold both divine revelation and cold ambition. He claimed he held the key, not just to personal salvation or the restoration of Korea, but to the final destiny of the entire world. His name was Sun Myung Moon. He was not a creature of academia or established theology. He was a man forged in the crucible of his time, a survivor of Japanese occupation, and, more critically, a prisoner in a North Korean labor camp. His story was a tapestry woven with threads of mysticism, suffering, and an unshakable conviction that bordered on the absolute. In the frozen hell of the Hungnam prison camp, where men were reduced to skeletal ghosts by starvation and labor, Moon didn't just survive, he began to preach. He saw his suffering not as a punishment, but as a divine test, a purification by fire that prepared him for his destiny. This experience became the bedrock of his authority. He had looked into the abyss of communism and human degradation and emerged with a vision. He claimed that years earlier, on a Korean mountainside at the age of 15, Jesus Christ himself had appeared before him, weeping, charging him with an unfinished mission: to complete the salvation of humanity. This was not a mere sermon, it was a new gospel, a complete and audacious rewriting of sacred history. He called it the divine principle, a radical and mesmerizing reinterpretation of the Bible that offered answers to the questions that haunted his generation. In his telling, Adam and Eve's fall was not merely one of disobedience, but a spiritual and physical corruption of God's bloodline by Satan. Jesus, he preached, had come to restore this lineage, but was crucified before he could marry and create a perfect family, leaving his mission tragically incomplete. The second coming, therefore, would not be a celestial event in the clouds, but the arrival of a new Messiah on earth, a Korean Messiah who would fulfill this mission, marry a perfect bride, and become the true parents to all of humankind, creating a new, purified lineage. This doctrine was a lightning bolt in the soul of a broken nation. It didn't just offer comfort, it offered a central role in the divine drama of the universe. Korea's immense suffering was reframed as a holy indemnity, a payment for the sins of the world. The nation was no longer a forgotten casualty of geopolitics. It was the new Eden, the stage for God's final act. To the young, the lost, and the searching, this was an intoxicating promise of meaning. In 1954, in a small, dilapidated house in Seoul, Moon founded the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. The first followers were not fanatics. They were idealists, university students, and war widows who saw in his powerful, unblinking gaze the reflection of their own deepest hopes. He offered them more than a religion. He offered them a family, a purpose, and a father. He was their true father, and they, his spiritual children, were tasked with building the kingdom of heaven on earth. But this new family, built on a promise of divine love and cosmic importance, would soon demand a level of sacrifice and obedience that no one could have imagined. For this was only the first layer of the story. The first years were a fever dream of communal devotion. Members moved into shared houses, their individual lives dissolving into a single collective purpose. Privacy became a relic of a former life. They slept in crowded rooms, ate from the same pot, and shared every waking moment, their thoughts and feelings constantly mirrored and reinforced by the group. They would listen to Moon preach for hours, sometimes through the night, his voice a torrent of divine revelation that washed over them, cleansing them of their pasts, their doubts, their very names. The world outside, with its politics and its pain, faded into a gray irrelevance. Inside their small, insulated world, there was only the mission. But the kingdom of heaven required earthly capital. The rupture did not begin with a dramatic schism, but with a quiet, creeping demand that slowly rewired their understanding of sacrifice. It started with fundraising. Young, bright-eyed students who once debated philosophy were now on the cold streets of Seoul, selling ginseng tea and flowers from dawn until long after dusk. They worked 18-hour days, their bodies aching with exhaustion, their voices hoarse from repeating the same sales pitch. They were told this was a spiritual discipline, a tangible way to pay indemnity for the sins of humanity. Each sale was a small victory against Satan. Each door slammed in their face a personal test of faith. The humiliation was part of the purification. Slowly, the walls between the group and the outside world grew higher, built brick by brick with each sacrifice. The most painful demand was the severing of family ties. They were taught that their biological parents, their siblings, their old friends were all part of a fallen lineage, vessels of Satan's influence. To remain connected was to invite spiritual contamination. This was the point of no return, a psychological amputation that left them utterly dependent on their new family, with Moon as their true father. University careers were abandoned, life savings were donated, and the individual self was systematically dismantled to be rebuilt in the image of the collective. As the group's practices grew more intense, so did the suspicion from the outside. Rumors began to swirl through the city, dark whispers of brainwashing, of families desperately trying to reclaim their children, of a charismatic leader holding his followers in an unbreakable thrall. In 1955, the whispers culminated in action. Moon was arrested and imprisoned on charges of draft evasion and, more scandalously, group immorality, accusations he fiercely denied and which were later dropped. For any other fledgling movement, this public disgrace would have been a death blow. But for Moon, it was a prophecy fulfilled. He masterfully turned persecution into a badge of honor. From his cell, the message was clear. The suffering they endured was the same suffering Christ faced. The world's hatred was not a sign of their error, but proof of their righteousness. This was the crucible. The external pressure did not break them. It fused them together, hardening their resolve into a diamond-like certainty. The arrest transformed their fear into righteous anger. They were no longer just a spiritual group. They were a besieged army of God, and their father, their Messiah, had been martyred for their truth. Their faith was no longer just a belief, it was a battle scar. Here begins the darkest part of the journey. When Moon was eventually released, he did not emerge as a humbled man seeking peace. He walked out as a conqueror, his myth now cemented in the fires of persecution. The experience had not taught him caution, it had taught him strategy. The spiritual battle for souls would now be fought with the tactics of a geopolitical war. The goal was no longer just Korea, it was the world. The Unification Church turned its eyes westward, towards the heart of the so-called satanic world, America. It arrived in the early 1970s, a perfect storm of opportunity. The nation was a landscape of fractured ideals, reeling from the Vietnam War and the disillusionment of the counterculture. Young people were adrift, searching for an anchor, a purpose greater than themselves. And the church offered them one, wrapped in a package of unnerving, absolute certainty. This is where the global manipulation machine was switched on. The recruitment strategy was a masterclass in psychological engineering. It began with a smile on a street corner, an invitation to dinner, an offer of community. This was the infamous love bombing, an overwhelming deluge of affection and attention that made the lonely and the lost feel seen, valued, and finally at home. But the warmth was the bait. The next step was a weekend workshop at a rural retreat, far from the familiar comforts of family and friends. Here, the architecture of control was erected, brick by brick. Days were filled with lectures that dismantled a recruit's entire worldview, replacing it with Moon's divine principle. Nights were short, sleep was scarce, and a state of heightened emotional and physical exhaustion was carefully maintained. Critical thought was systematically broken down, dismissed as Satan's influence. Doubts were not explored. They were purged in tearful group confessions. The individual was dissolved into the collective, their identity reforged as a child of the true parents, Moon and his wife. But this new family demanded a steep price, total devotion, which meant total labor. The spiritual war required a war chest. Soon, legions of young, clean-cut Moonies became a familiar sight on city streets, selling flowers, candy, and trinkets with a relentless, glassy-eyed fervor. They worked 18-hour days, sleeping in vans, turning over every penny to the church. This wasn't framed as labor. It was a sacred act of indemnity, a way to pay off humanity's spiritual debt. Through their sacrifice, they were funding the expansion of a global empire that soon included newspapers like the Washington Times, fishing fleets, manufacturing plants, and vast real estate holdings. The line between church and corporation had vanished completely. Yet the most profound instrument of control was yet to come. It was the ultimate demonstration of Moon's power over the lives of his followers, the mass weddings. In enormous stadiums, thousands of couples, often strangers who had just met, stood side by side to be married in a single ceremony, personally matched by Sun Myung Moon himself. He claimed a divine insight that allowed him to create perfect, sinless unions, transcending race and nationality. But its true function was strategic. It severed the last remaining ties to the outside world, replacing biological families with a new lineage loyal only to him. Your life, your labor, and now your most intimate relationship all belong to the church. The movement was no longer a faith. It was a self-contained reality, a global network of minds, money, and bodies, all orchestrated by a single man who saw himself not as a prophet, but as the king of the world. But a kingdom built on the absolute will of one man is a fragile thing, a monument of glass waiting for a tremor. As Sun Myung Moon aged, the gilded cage of his divine family began to rust from within. The perfect world he preached was, behind closed doors, consumed by the very human poisons of jealousy, rivalry, and bitter ambition. His death in 2012 was not the dawn of a unified world under God. It was the trigger for a theological civil war. The Messiah was gone, But his multi-billion-dollar global empire remained, a vast, sprawling inheritance of businesses, media outlets, and properties that became the battlefield for his heirs. The single, monolithic church shattered. His wife, Hak Jahan, seized control of the mainstream faction, attempting a grand rebranding. She became the true mother, the sole heir to the divine mandate, steering the movement towards the more palatable language of a family-focused global peace organization. But this claim to authority was not universally accepted. Some of his children, believing themselves to be the true inheritors of their father's spiritual bloodline, rejected her rule. They saw her as a usurper, and the schism was deep and venomous. One son, Hyung Jin Sean Moon, carved out the most radical offshoot, the World Peace and Unification Sanctuary, more commonly known as the Rod of Iron Ministries. Here, the subtext of his father's militant anti-communism became the explicit text. The church fused Moon's theology with extreme right-wing American politics and a fervent, almost fetishistic worship of firearms. The AR-15 rifle was elevated to a holy object, the physical embodiment of the biblical rod of iron needed to defend the coming kingdom of God. The mass weddings, that signature ritual of control, continued. But now, couples in white gowns and dark suits clutched assault rifles as they took their vows, the cold steel a stark symbol of how the ideology had mutated. The global manipulation machine did not simply shut down, it splintered and evolved. The Unification Church today is a ghost of its former, unified self, yet its legacy is deeply embedded in the modern landscape. The Washington Times, a media asset born from Moon's strategic vision, continues to exert influence in conservative political circles in the United States, a sophisticated tool of soft power. The Universal Peace Federation, an NGO with consultative status at the United Nations, provides the movement with a crucial veneer of international legitimacy, hosting lavish conferences with world leaders who may be entirely unaware of the organization's authoritarian foundations. The money, the influence, and the political connections cultivated over decades did not disappear with Moon. They were simply inherited and repurposed. But the most profound and lasting consequence is not measured in assets or political sway. It is measured in the quiet suffering of the second and third generations, the children born inside the self-contained reality their parents had joined. They inherited a faith they did not choose, a destiny forged by a man they knew only as a distant, godlike figure. For them, leaving was not just an act of youthful rebellion, it was an existential earthquake, a betrayal of their entire universe that meant losing their family, their community, and the very framework of their identity. The true cost of this spiritual empire is etched into the stories of those who navigated its labyrinth of control, and the silent exodus of those who fought their way out into a world they were taught to fear. Consider the story of a girl we will call Anna. She was not a recruit. She was an inheritance, a soul promised to the cause before she took her first breath. Born in the 1980s to parents matched by Moon in a stadium ceremony, her reality was stitched together from the threads of the divine principle. The portraits of the true parents hung in every room, their benevolent gazes a constant reminder of her divine lineage and her sacred duty. Her own parents, devoted foot soldiers in the spiritual war, were often away on fundraising missions for months, sometimes years at a time. Their absence was filled by the community, a warm, enveloping blanket of shared purpose that also served as a cage. She knew no other life. Her friends, her education, her future spouse, all were predetermined by the cosmic blueprint laid out by Moon. For Anna, the fallen world outside was a terrifying abstraction, a chaotic sea of sin and loneliness from which she had been miraculously saved. But the first crack in her reality did not come from a dramatic revelation. It came from a quiet, forbidden corner of a public library, during a rare moment of unsupervised study for a high school project. A book on social psychology, picked up out of idle curiosity, contained chapters on group dynamics, cognitive dissonance, and the mechanics of undue influence. The words were clinical, cold, but they landed on her soul like sparks on dry tinder. Suddenly, the unquestionable truths of her childhood began to look like carefully constructed walls. The constant pressure to be perfect, the public confessions of spiritual failings designed to induce shame and conformity, the arranged marriage to a man she barely knew. It all shifted under this new, terrifying light. It was the horrifying realization that the mechanics of a cult described on the page were the everyday architecture of her own life. The decision to leave was not a single event, but a slow, agonizing tearing of the self over many months. It meant becoming an orphan by choice. Her parents, when she finally summoned the courage to tell them, did not scream or rage. Their reaction was far worse, a deep, bottomless sorrow. They saw her not as a young woman seeking freedom, but as a cherished soul being dragged into eternal damnation by Satan himself. Their love was so completely fused with the doctrine that in rejecting one, she was forfeiting the other forever. Their pleas were not for her to stay, but for her to save herself from a hell they believed was terrifyingly real. Stepping out into the world was like being born for a second time, but at 22, with no one to catch her. She had never had a bank account, never written a resume, never chosen her own clothes from a store. Every simple decision was a mountain of anxiety. The silence of living alone was deafening after a lifetime of communal prayer and song. The hardest part was rebuilding an identity from the ruins. Who was she without the church? For years she was haunted by a phantom guilt, a deeply ingrained fear that she had made a catastrophic spiritual mistake. She had to learn the world from scratch, not as a child does, with wonder, but as a refugee does, with caution and fear. Her story, in its quiet tragedy, is one of thousands. It is the story of the human cost of a divine vision, the unseen psychological price paid for a kingdom built not on faith, but on the absolute and systematic surrender of the self. The architecture of such a kingdom is always the same. It is built not on a foundation of stone and steel, but upon a far more elemental human material. The yearning for purpose, the desperate hunger for community, and the profound desire for a clear, simple answer in a world of overwhelming noise. Sun Myung Moon did not invent this yearning. He was simply a master architect who understood its power. He saw the fractures in the post-war soul, the existential dread of the Cold War, and the spiritual vacuum of modernity, and he designed a structure to fill it. He offered a grand, unifying story, a cosmic drama in which every lost soul could be a protagonist, a soldier in a holy war against chaos. The price of admission was deceptively small, the individual. The history of the Unification Church is therefore more than the chronicle of a single movement. It is a cautionary tale written in the universal language of power, faith, and psychology. It reveals with chilling clarity that the most effective walls are not those that surround us, but those we build inside ourselves. They are prisons of certainty, constructed brick by brick with simplified truths, a designated enemy, and the intoxicating promise of belonging. The mortar that holds it all together is the slow, systematic erosion of critical thought, where questioning becomes a sin and doubt is a betrayal. Within these walls, reality is redefined, language is repurposed, and the leader's voice becomes the sole arbiter of truth, drowning out the quiet, essential whisper of the self. This brings us to the ultimate, enduring question that echoes through the corridors of this history. It is not a question of what we believe, but how we believe. Does our faith, our ideology, our community serve to expand our empathy, deepen our understanding, and empower our critical faculties? Or does it demand we abandon them at the door as a prerequisite for entry? The line between a supportive community and an ideological cage is terrifyingly thin. It is crossed the moment we outsource our moral compass, the moment we accept that the ends justify any means, and the moment we agree that our shared truth is more important than objective reality. The patterns are timeless. The allure of the all-encompassing answer is stronger than ever in our fragmented digital age. We seek refuge in ideological tribes and digital echo chambers that offer the same seductive promise, clarity, purpose, and a shared enemy. We are constantly tempted to trade the difficult, messy work of individual thought for the comfort of a prepackaged worldview. The mechanisms of control have changed, but the fundamental human vulnerability remains the same. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of the Moonies is this chilling and profound lesson, that the road to any promised heaven on earth, any perfect society, is often paved with the loss of the very things that make us human: our doubts, our complexities, our freedom to choose and to err. It is the story of a paradise purchased with the currency of the soul, and that is a price far too high for any kingdom to demand. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the shadows of history. We invite you to share your reflections in the comments below.